copper bulb? No. I can't think of what I'm looking for the life of me. Alright, hello and happy Tuesday. I have been experimenting on building tree houses, but rather than show you the one that I built off camera, I thought it might be a good segment to let y'all know that I'm still alive. I haven't stopped breathing quite yet, and I intend to do something about it. This breathing thing, let's say. I have such fun with these mangroves. Okay, so as many of you may know, there have been a ton of changes to Minecraft, especially recently. And by recently, I'm a little behind the times, so I definitely do mean the last like 3 years. They've added a couple new variants of trees. I did a video pretty much immediately when the Warp Forest came out, just showcasing the idea. But, you know, I've been a sculptor for about 20 years, and I've made a lot of little villages and islands out of clay during that time. Lots of little alien forests, lots of tree-based structures. And, you know, I mean, I guess one of the things I've learned... Oh, that one auto-generated. See, this is what I like about mangroves. You can just plonk them down wherever, and they just grow because they want to. It's very refreshing. They're very giving trees. I love these ones very much. So, when the Warp Forest first came out, I did a short... tutorial, was it? I mean, I just kind of showed you can put down netherite and netherrack. You can put down warped nylium. You can put down warped nylium and add warped fungus and crimson fungus, and when you add them, you can grow new trees immediately adjacent to existing trees. So why that was a big deal for me, let's just take a moment to illustrate the concept, because I guess I don't exactly know where I'm going with this, and it helps to visualize to people what I'm talking about, because I have argued with real architects for hours about this whole idea. So what am I even trying to get at? I'm trying to get at real tree houses. How do you make this in real life? And I think Minecraft is an incredibly powerful drafting tool, because not only do you have the capacity to make a 3D structure, you can also move around in it and like witness its dimensions, like get a sense of how big it is, what its physicality in the world looks like, how it operates, what's around it, and how it interacts with what's around it. You can actually see lighting. It's really a simple game, or at least it started out that way. It's just like Lego. Everything that you do in this game extends beyond what you can imagine. Really, literally, that is the limit, is you have this medium that is completely flexible, and whatever you can imagine, you can create. And it's a lot faster than building it in real life. You get the feeling that maybe placing these blocks is sort of like something that you could do in real life. But when you take a look at something like a treehouse like this, you see the shape, you see the outline, and you wonder to yourself, how would something like this actually grow? So, the initial problem that I had was when I would try to build tree houses in old school Minecraft, which is to say pre-being able to put wood blocks sideways, I would put down a sapling here, and I would put down a sapling here, and they'd be right next to each other, and I'd grow one, and then I'd try to grow the other, and it wouldn't work because the block immediately adjacent is excluded. So the reason I was excited about warp nylium and crimson fungus being able to grow trees next to each other is I could imagine making a treehouse whose walls grew like this to totally fill in the space. And then I also wondered if I could make structures after the fact for like a doorway and windows. And in order to add a doorway and windows, you actually have to remove blocks, and you have to be able to put blocks sideways. So those were two developments in like the base model of Minecraft that actually improved my ability to depict these sort of tree structures. So the first being really the fact that you can put these blocks sideways, because until you could put blocks sideways, I couldn't show windows or basically the upper part of a doorway without having exposed interior wood. So the other benefit was with crimson and nylium. In both of those situations, you can plant trees adjacent to each other and make complete walls. But even in those, I couldn't actually make windows without removing some blocks and then putting new blocks down. This will all make sense in a minute. Or maybe it won't. Maybe you won't understand my genius, and that is something I'm just going to have to live with, that not everyone is intelligent or beautiful or cool enough to understand what I'm trying to say. And to those people, I hope you get well soon, and that's about it. Let's see. The third development that was important was mangrove wood. Not specifically mangrove wood. This block, it is labeled the same, but it has a different block ID. It must, but I don't really know if that's relevant now. Here. Okay, the next thing that was relevant was this block that is basically for every block of wood, you can make one where the bark, where the outer surface is on all, count them, 8 sides, 6 sides, all 6 sides. And that allowed me to cover corners. So when a corner is present, you'll see I didn't do this, because if you do this, or if you do this, you've got exposed center wood. I think that's pretty obvious, so I won't belabor it. But this perfectly illustrates the problem, which is, on the top, it still has this orientation. Whether it's like vertical or horizontal, it'll still show up. So it's based on how it's placed. And all of these things actually illustrate real, real behaviors in the wood. So if you were to imagine for a second, take it out of Cube World and put it in real world, there's all these situations where this, where the way that something grows affects how the bark is positioned and structured, and how it looks on the surface. So that is called anisotropy when we're talking about its structural properties, and I think it applies as well in the aesthetic sort of fabric of this. So in this example here, you've got this door frame, which grows vertically. These are vertical pieces. And you'll see that the bark has what are called, well, I mean, they're horizontal, so they're horizontal, and they're striations, meaning lines or grooves, or just line-like features in a surface. So horizontal striations, right? And so this has horizontal striations. So you would imagine that probably the way that this grew was that this block grew first, then this block, then this block. And then you get to here and you realize that whatever was growing, just bear with me, is growing in this direction now. So this one grew out, and then it grew this way. And this one grew out, and then it grew this way. So these two bodies that are growing into each other there. And at the same time, you've had this body growing out, and it stops, right? And then all of this that's moving around the circle fills it in, right? So all of this gives you an impression of a growth process, even though this didn't result from a growth process. This is just placing blocks around. But by making this sort of model, I can show you what something would look like if it were finished, and discuss how it came to be that way, how it came to be structured that way. So in this example, we've got basically complete walls with just little cutouts for the windows, right? And on the top, we've got a little structure with leftover space to fill in a floor. And I think that the leaf blocks are perfect in Minecraft for filling in a floor. In real life, could you imagine a building that had a bunch of branches for a floor? I have a feeling that that would not feel particularly stable. So probably that aspect doesn't belong in real life. What am I looking for? I am actually looking for the video settings because I always forget that my computer was purchased in the glorious year 2020 when nothing interesting happened at all. So it's been 5 years now, and if anybody else were to tell me that, I think I'd have to punch them in the face right now, because oh wow, I've lost track of time. Let's see. So I think as window material, this is also great. It's natural, it lets light through, it blends very nicely into the structure, and you'll notice we've got a little vine climb up down here, which is connected to something that was pre-existing, generated with the world. And since we've got these pre-existing vines, I really like random, strange, messy world generation symptoms. So I'm actually going to build this into this structure, and just give it a little homage, highlight it. But you'll see there's a method in all of the block placements. If I do it correctly, there's a certain flow which needs to be achieved in order for a certain structure to make any sense, really. So we go here, and we go here, and we go here, and again, you've kind of got this impression of two bodies colliding, right? So everywhere it forms a loop, you've sort of got a situation where the energy that the plant, right? Let's just go back to basics. You see this swamp tree, right? Now, in Minecraft, trees don't have any roots, which is completely fictitious, right? Trees actually have a parallel system. So I've heard it said by plant biology professors, but never followed up and verified it, but it sounds true. I've heard that there is an equal mass or volume of root material to shoot material. So underneath this tree, there's just as much material filling out all of what would be the leaf blocks in Minecraft, with really fine root structure. Okay, what is that root structure for? It's for pulling minerals and water up, and in exchange, the leaves send nutrients and sugars down. So basically, everything that they make through photosynthesis to enable them to make carbohydrates and proteins and fats, all of that goes down to the roots. and the roots use that to grow more roots and to get more minerals. So it's this self-sustaining structure. But in a real tree, you've got this situation where if there's a gap in the outer surface, that gap needs to be filled in, or else mushrooms and fungus will grow inside that material and eat out all of the structural support. So wood to a tree is its bones, and on top of the bones are a layer of living material, and that living material grows outwards, and as it grows outwards it leaves behind more bone on the inside. But unlike in the human body, where bones still have living cells in them, in plants there are ideally no living cells in this inner material, in the wood. That's what the wood is. It's old, well, it's old veins, basically. Old veins that bring up water and minerals from the roots to the shoots. So below the soil line is roots, above the soil line is shoots. And if you think about it, the whole tree actually looks like this. It looks like a single block, completely covered on all sides with bark, and as it gets bigger it expands. But it doesn't expand evenly over that surface. It expands more in certain directions than others. So the trunk, for example, is it expanding vertically. And the branches are it extending out in each direction from that central point. But at all points, if the tree is to remain healthy, it has to maintain a complete 360-degree, both pitch and yaw, I guess is the way to say it, but completely all the way around this sphere needs to be covered in bark so that it can continue adding more material. And in that whole process, it's always fighting a parallel process of rot and decay. So everywhere in this structure that we've left open pieces, that's a place where a mushroom can get in and start eating the material from the inside. So we want to fill in those gaps. Again, in Minecraft and in real life, things are different, and there are different requirements for all of them. But I like to try to make as accurate a model as possible if I'm going to try to actually do something. So where am I going with this next? You know what? I'm glad you asked. Because where I'm going with this next is I'm going to explain why the idea of complete walls makes no sense. So, in order to get a complete full wall, you have to have a body of tissue, and then you have to cause it to grow evenly along that whole distance. And as a tree goes and explores its environment and its root network expands out, it'll encounter different concentrations and varieties of nutrients, and different parts will inevitably have different levels of growth over time. And those differences multiply as the tree gets older. And trees, as they grow, tend to cause more growth in some areas than others through their hormone structure. So when I say hormone structure, what I mean is there's a flow of hormones that's going through the surface of the bark at all times. Those hormones are different. One of the key ones is indole acetic acid, IAA. It's an auxin. The other is auxins and gibberellins. There's ethylene, which is a gas, so it works differently. It's not really directing growth for the most part, but I'm just rambling. The point is, all of the interplay of the hormones with the proteins and signaling molecules in the tree lead to a situation where the longest branch, the longest extension of that sphere is the one that gets the most additional growth. So it'll continue growing intentionally from its strongest point. Now, if you go and trim that off as a pruner, this is from my pruning class with Jack Van Dunhoven. That was last year, sort of around this time of year, but I learned a lot from him, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of wisdom that I learned from him. So, once you cut off that branch, the tree is going to use basically latent buds to start new outgrowths. So what do I mean by a latent bud? Well, a bud is a meristem. And what do I mean by a meristem? I'm glad you asked. A meristem is the embryonic form of the shoots, essentially. So when the seed germinates in the soil and gets ready to send out shoots and roots, it sends one root down and it sends one shoot up. And the shoot has this interesting characteristic where the first set of leaves are called cotyledons, and they're in dicots, which is a category of plants. It's most of the plants you're probably thinking of. It's not grasses, it's not pineapples, and it's not bananas, but that's just a starting point. In that first shoot, there are two leaves which are basically round. They're just little blobby round leaves. And when they poke up from the soil, they look kind of like a little snail with a pair of eyes. And those two eyes are the cotyledons. Now, every set of leaves after that tend to be the same. There are exceptions. But after the cotyledons, you get more variety in what the leaves can look like. So if it's a maple, for example, the first set of leaves, the cotyledons, will just be two round little blobs. In Japanese maple, they're sort of elongated, so they're more like a paddle, but still very blobby and not very complicated. And the second set of leaves will be actually the proper maple leaf shape. And after that, every other set of leaves is just a maple leaf shape. In that process, every time a new set of leaves is coming up, those leaves are gaining a new shoot apical meristem. So think about it like this. You add one block, and then you add a meristem. You add one block, and then you add a meristem. You add one block, and then guess what we add? That's right, a meristem. So now all of these points have a new meristem. If you cut it off here, the meristem that was here, that got left behind, right? That's what a latent bud is. A latent bud is a meristem that's been hidden away under the bark and not activated. But once this branch gets cut off, it will send out a new, basically it's like a new apex. It's like a new tallest branch. And so now this branch gets slightly more of the resources because it grew faster than this branch did. Why are there two of them? I hear you asking. That is a question I don't know the answer to. That is a question I would very much like to know the answer to. Because it doesn't have to be just two. If you observe places where people have very aggressively just cut back a very large limb from the trunk of a tree in a single step without allowing a new apex to form, all of the growth hormone appears to be just pooling at the base, and it sends a huge flurry of branches in all directions. And often what you'll see is you'll see a bunch of branches that just go up vertically from that point. Like so. What am I trying to say? Well, I'm glad you asked. There is no point in trying to fill in these gaps. That's the critical insight. Once you have this situation determined, you actually have the perfect basis for the frame of a skyscraper. I explained this basically in my other video about scissor splicing. And I said, this is what this enables. But I've had a critical insight recently, which is that I usually leave most of the interpretation of what I say to my audience. And not to be glib and to be 100% real for a second, I have observed that my message very rarely actually gets across that way. And I think it makes sense to give a step-by-step explanation of what I'm trying to say with as much context as I can really give in order to make sense of this to the viewer. Why have I been doing these random, sort of sketchy, very low budget videos for, I think it has been 5 years now? What is it that she's actually trying to get across? And I'm trying to spell it out as clearly as I can. I mean, we should be building tree skyscrapers. This should be how we live, how we grow. This should be the kind of structure that we inhabit frequently. This should be the way to build. This should be the default option because it's cheap, sustainable, it's right here. All it means, all it requires of us as individual human beings is to pay attention to the trees around us, literally the ones that are growing right around us, and to start working with them. I mean, in enough time, with enough people dedicated to that process, you really could start growing things like this. This could be 100% real. I just showed you exactly what you would need to make this a reality. It's not really all that complicated in principle. You have one major branch, one major runner, you lop it off, and it creates this candelabra. And when that candelabra is created, branches between them can be scissor spliced together and make these loops. And once you have these loops, you have structural support, you have arches. Now, the floors are branches here. That doesn't make a lot of sense. I personally think that the best kind of floor in the real world is probably something straight, rigid, and solid. It's not a place to be messing around or experimenting too much. So maybe metal, maybe some secret third thing that I haven't thought of yet. But we've got 2 levels to this. Let's add a third, right? We can just keep going. How do I do this? You know, I mean, is the question that I've been asking myself. Is it about acquiring land? Is it about owning some land and doing this? Because it kind of, at that scale, has the feeling of these ocean cities that people keep talking about, like Peter Thiel, right? With a giant turtle I don't know if that was the one he invested in, but you know the one I'm thinking of, I think. The idea of like growing a civilization that's free from international law out on the ocean, and the problem has always been like, what's the profit motive, right? Like, you'd have to, how do you make money in this society? And I think as soon as you start thinking about that, you've already deviated from any possibility of having an anti-capitalist structure, which is very funny, because I think money has become, from the time it was invented, such a basic concept to people that we confuse it with things like food and water and shelter. Because in our day-to-day lives, food and water and shelter result from having money, having access to money. It's just part of the process of acquiring those things. And I don't think that conditioning, I don't think it's lost on us. I think it just embeds itself really deeply in our nervous system, that money is survival. And I think that's what it's designed to do. And I do think designed is the right word. I think that the creation of money was an intentional decision by a group of people who realized the benefit of using it to condition people. Now, when you say things like that, people confuse it very quickly, because a lot of I'm jumping into a shark pit, but a lot of white supremacists have pushed this narrative that it is Jewish people who are to blame for that, and that is bullshit, and that is anti-Semitic, and that is not something I'm going to share as a belief. And if that's what you believe, get the fuck off my channel, because you're not welcome here. So, why am I talking about money? The reason that the ocean cities, the anti-whatever, free society with no international law, is... the reason that never gets off the ground is because there's no real profit motive. You build your anarchist commune, it's self-sustaining, that's amazing, you're out in the ocean, nobody can touch you, you can do, I don't know, whatever crazy, unethical bullshit you want to do out in the middle of international waters, but you can't get any money, so you can't trade with the established land-based communities around you. And so isolation, and isolation leads to death. That's the fundamental driving force of human civilization and history. Isolation always kills you. And if you're not able to participate in the exchange of ideas or of goods, you will eventually lose relevance and die. And that's kind of like the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark! JK, no sponsors allowed. And also, fuck Surfshark specifically. Let's see. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Yeah, so there's no profit motive, right? You have a piece of land, let's say, and you have 1,000 trees on it. And you decide, I think that Senpai's sister is the coolest. I love her idea. I think it's great. I'm going to follow all of the instruction to the letter, and I'm going to grow basically a giant tree skyscraper in the middle of the woods, right? And you own that land. You're responsible for paying taxes on that land. You are required by the structure of society to use that land to generate money. It's not optional. It is built into the very premise of owning the land in the first place. You have to pay tax on the land in order to use the land for any purpose. So, you start this self-sustaining tree structure on a random piece of land, and now you're responsible for paying taxes. How do you generate a profit with that piece of land? I guess you could say, let's rent it out, right? And while that does answer the question in the immediate term for you, it is really, at the heart of it, just kicking the can along. Because the money that your customers are putting into it is made in some way. Maybe it's made through agriculture, right? Maybe it's made through mining, right? But however the taxes are getting paid, there's some destructive process. There's some extraction from the natural world that is occurring in order to generate the wealth that then gets basically converted or represented by money. Of course, the thing is, the resources are being generated and the money is being generated at the same time. Both of those things are happening concurrently. It's just that because they're associated with one another, our brains are very good at drawing this like correlation. We think that because money is constantly being printed and people are constantly generating resources, that it's the generation of the resources which creates the money. But that's not true. The money is created independently and would be created regardless of whether the resources were created, because that's what drives inflation. That's what constantly drives the cost and the value of the goods that are produced, of the resources that are produced, to constantly be less and less. So if I mine a metric ton of copper today and I want to sell it on the market, it's less valuable to me the next day I sell it, and the day after that, and the day after that, because of inflation. Constantly, what I can sell that value for is less. So I'm incentivized to sell it as fast as possible. And all of this is in service of a neoliberal agenda. And now what do I mean by neoliberal? Because that word gets used without really explaining the context behind it. So neoliberalism, I'm not going to go into the complete history of it, but one neoliberal idea is that the maximization of trade is in itself a fundamental good for humanity. The more people are trading resources and the faster they are trading resources, the better society is functioning overall. This idea is reflected in the idea of having a quote-unquote strong economy. What does that mean? It means lots of trading is being done, lots of revenue is being generated, lots of exchanges are being made, and lots of taxes are being paid as a result of those exchanges. So it's a whole structure of psychological effort and psychological warfare to convince people that it is necessary to make as much money as possible, to produce as many resources as possible, and to maximize this dollar sign thing, this basically imaginary good, because we've substituted what the money represents with what the money actually is enabling, which is trade, right? Trade of real resources. I know this seems very in the weeds, but I promise it's directly connected to what I'm creating here. On a piece of land, carbon capture happens when plants grow and they are not fully consumed. They're not fully converted back into carbon dioxide. This is really simple, okay? I mean, I can provide citations, but I feel like if you are capable of reason as a human being, this is easy to understand. If a tree grows and tomorrow you chop it down and you burn it completely, right, to make electricity, you have not decreased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You have not captured any carbon dioxide. You have not done any good for the ecosystem at all. At best, what you've done is not any harm. That is the absolute limit of what that approach can do. So, you need a situation where a grassland or a forest is allowed to produce wood or grass or mangroves, right? In a saltwater environment, in a brackish shoreline environment, make a lot of mangroves. And for those trees and those grasses and whatever else, kelp was the thing I was trying to think of. If you take all of those things and you allow them to grow, those things then act as a carbon store that can then go into the ground, into the soil, stored deep and not burned. And that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, untaxed land, growing abundant vegetation, and rotting into the soil, slowly building up a soil layer, is the antidote to climate change. People have talked about carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. Basically, those processes are active processes. They require energy to run, and any energy that you produce to run them would be better used just offsetting the emissions of the carbon fuels that we're burning to generate the electricity. So let me give you an example, right? So if you run a diesel generator to run carbon capture, that's stupid because you're not able to, because of the laws of thermodynamics, capture as much carbon with that energy as you released by burning the fuel. Now, the physics of that, how confident am I? I'm going to say I'm like 80% confident that it's a fundamental limit and that there's absolutely no way to burn an amount of fuel that then recaptures itself perfectly. Like the theoretical optimum is that it captures itself perfectly. And I mean, just as a human being with the ability to reason, you have to, I don't understand how you can escape the conclusion that it would be better to just leave the lump of coal in your hand and not burn it than to burn it to run carbon capture. And I think anybody who's telling you that you need to burn coal to capture coal's emissions is a grifter and further a reprehensible person. And many people in the government today are exactly that. And I think most people in the government today are exactly that. People will shill for basically anyone that will give them a dime. And I think it's sort of disgusting and infuriating. And what is this rant actually getting at? If you had a tree city, and some of these trees were fruit trees, right? Just for the sake of argument, you could grow all of the food that you need. You could put the compost back into the soil, and you could allow soil building to occur at the base of your tree, right? One problem is, remember when I said earlier that there's a root and a shoot portion of a tree, and between them there is basically, it's called the hypocotyl. It's below the cotyledons is what it literally means, but it's what would originally have been where the seed germinated. And it's not really visible on the tree in most cases, but it does exist. And if you build up soil above this spark line, it's not really good for most trees to have soil up against the shoots. So, you know, you could have compost, you could have soil building, but you'd have to be kind of careful that you're not dehydrating these trunks, right? Or not overhydrating these trunks. Because if they get overhydrated, that kills plants, just like if you've ever killed a houseplant by overwatering it. You can do that with a whole tree quite easily. And piling too much soil around the base of a living tree is a great way to do that. So you'd have to be careful about where you put your compost and how you apply the new soil, but I think that there's definitely room for soil building in this kind of scheme. So you could be totally self-sufficient, I think is the point, right? You grow your fruit in the tree keeps growing. Every time new branches get taller, right, you can add a new level to the structure just because all of these pre-existing chunks of wood are just growing. They just grow up. And so if you keep splicing them, you keep getting new layers to this tree. Now, am I saying that the government and society are fundamentally opposed to this idea and they'll do anything to stop this from being published and made widely known, and that I'm being censored, and that basically CIA operatives are haunting me at every step to stop me from making Tree Cities a reality? No, I don't think I'll say that, because that sounds fucking crazy. It just feels true. It just feels like what's going on, because it just, otherwise, this is a very obvious thing to do. We're tree dwellers. I've had this argument with a certain person, and if you're listening, I'm giving the explanation now. We are tree dwellers. We were then pushed into the savanna by deforestation, and we learned to use fire. And at some point, those two things passed. Which came first? I'm not going to comment, okay? But the savanna became the habitat after that, around the time when we were becoming more bipedal, because being able to climb in the trees was a less valuable skill, right? So why am I saying all that? I'm glad you asked. You are very helpful in this imaginary conversation. Thank you. Why did I talk about that? Because in the transition from an arboreal to a bipedal lifestyle, we must have lost contact with as many trees in our environment and stopped thinking of them in the same way as a consequence. I'm just imagining, I'm speculating here, but I think that we used to have a very close relationship with trees that then was eroded. And I mean, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. We have very fragile young, and if we're up in the branches all the time, it's very easy to imagine a newborn chimp or a newborn hominid falling out of a branch and bonking its little head, and then it's out of the gene pool, right? So I think it kind of makes sense that bipedalism and big brains kind of go together with coming out of the trees. And, like, can you imagine a chimp trying to do scissor splicing? How do you do that? You climb out on a branch to get to its thinnest point to connect two tips, right? But its thinnest point is also its weakest point, and also furthest away from the trunk. So you're inevitably going to fall down unless there's a much stronger branch immediately next to this super weak branch. And then you splice together the super weak branch and come back and chop off the bigger branch. It's just a lot of steps to kind of infer. It's hard for that behavior to evolve, but why didn't it? And if it did, what kind of evidence would we actually have? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb. There is a community in India, and I don't remember the name of it. I'll put it up on the description or something like that. But basically in this community, the mangroves, which are native there, are used to make these like root bridges. So there's this canyon with a creek flowing through it, and the roots of the trees have been thrown across the river to create this bridge. And then over generations, it's been reinforced with more and more material. And the nice thing about the shoots of these, I believe they are mangroves, the shoots of these trees actually produce what are called aerial roots. So from the branches, they'll drop down these root threads, and those root threads can then drop into the ground. I think figs, there's a kind of fig that can do this too. But basically it means that those trees would be incredibly convenient for making and connecting new structures. Because they just naturally, from the branches, put down these pillars. So what was I saying about these pillars? Well, if you're building with a series of pillars like this, you already have space for the windows. So rather than making a bunch of material and then removing it, you just don't have it in the first place. You just don't have it in the first place. You don't have it, so you don't have to remove it. I think it's brilliant, and I mean, you know, it's stupid, but it's true, and I think very smart. So I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for that, because, you know, if you're gonna be hunted by the government and persecuted by society for being right about everything, you might as well at least believe in yourself. That's you could quote me on that. So, what next? What comes next? I mean, is the only solution to start a legitimate large-scale revolution against everyone who wants to extract resources from the environment in order to make a series of tree cities? And the reason I'm discussing this so openly is because I think probably that solution wouldn't be effective. And I'm going to provide a demonstration to explain why. We don't like capitalism! We don't like your situation! Fuck you! Rawr! Well, let's see how you handle this situation. I think it becomes pretty clear, pretty immediately, how difficult it is to defend something like this. Of course, in Minecraft, it stays afloat. The whole structure keeps on standing, even though, you know, we've got the base burned through now, right? The base is gone, and the fire is still raging. So, we could put water in the structure, so it finds its way around, right? I mean, if we have a pool of standing water, there's at least something that can theoretically be broken through and splash down and try to put out the fire. But like in Minecraft, you can't control where the fire's cutting through, right? And unless you perfectly cover the new surface with water, you don't actually put out the fire. And you need to keep that water somehow, right? Now, if only trees were constantly pumping water into the sky, wouldn't that be convenient? Well, it turns out that's exactly what they're doing, because that's what they are for. A tree is a bunch of straws pretending to be a living thing. And what those straws are doing is they're very thin, and they use capillary action to pull water up. Now, some of you in the comments are very smart, and you're saying, Symbiosis, that's not the only thing that drives... Yeah, I know, okay? I know. You're very smart, okay? You're very smart. It's not the only thing that drives it, but capillary action is probably involved. The fact that they are very thin straws, and through a very thin straw, liquid draws up on its own without any effort, I think that's a pretty good enough argument to say why this is the way that it is. Is it the only thing? No. It's also the fact that carbon dioxide is being inhaled. But basically the way that the carbon dioxide is being inhaled is because water is being exhaled. So, how do I explain that? The water is being drawn up through these straws, right? And at the surface of all of the leaves, like this, at the surface of these leaves, they're releasing water. But not really liquid water, they're releasing not really gaseous water. They're releasing water vapor, right? A bunch of little droplets suspended and emulsified in air. So, those water droplets getting released causes basically, well, it's the law of equivalent exchange. Newton's something, the law of thermodynamics. You know what, I'm not even going to guess. But every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So water is coming out of the leaves, and that draws an air current into the leaves. And that air current is used partially to make sure that new carbon dioxide is coming into the leaf that can then be, used for photosynthesis. And when it's used for photosynthesis, it makes sugars, it makes the building blocks of proteins and lipids, makes all the other good stuff. So, because it's always pumping up water, it's naturally got some fire resistance. But you also want to have some water on hand. So if you were to build a dome over the whole thing, that would collect water and drip it down on the inside. So, you know those survival kits for people who are stranded at sea? They have, if you've watched Castaway, I think he uses that in the first couple of weeks to get water. It's basically a little plastic balloon, and you put it out as a float on the surface of the ocean. And as a float on the surface of the ocean, it starts collecting water that evaporates off of the sea. And from there, you just drink it. You just drink it. It evaporates into the little balloon, it drips down off the inner surface of the balloon into a little cup in the center, and you drink the water from the cup. So, something like that could be done here, where you collect, that little bit. But then you have to remember that that's fucking stupid, because every single one of these trees is always doing that. It's always releasing water vapor. And there are trees everywhere, covering the entire landmass. And every one of those is pumping more water vapor into the atmosphere. And then what happens? Well, it comes down as rain. So basically, instead of having a giant bell over an individual tree, the rain just comes down and nourishes the trees. So in the Amazon rainforest, for example, there's enough of this going on, there are enough trees pumping up enough water vapor that the Amazon rainforest actually creates its own weather. Now this is, again, something that I've just heard on a lot of documentaries, and I haven't seen it substantially challenged. Does that mean that it's true? It sounds true, and it makes sense, and I personally believe it. Does that mean that you should believe it uncritically? No, definitely not. Don't believe anything uncritically. In fact, don't believe anything I say for the most part. I am, a strange person with an agenda, I suppose, is maybe the way. I didn't want a gender, so I went with agenda. So, maybe don't, completely believe everything I say. But do that, actually, because that benefits me. Let's see. The Amazon rainforest generates its own weather, right? So, in recent years, climate change has been putting a lot more pressure, and slash and burn farming and agriculture have created a lot of pressure as well on the Amazon, and there is a good chance that any decade now it'll flip to a state of savanna where it's more flammable than it was before, and fire predominates the ecosystem in a more, really. There's just going to be more fire in the Amazon, and that's going to lead to it being more of a savanna type environment. Now, what I'm saying is, because there is that pattern of basically a forest losing enough trees that suddenly it loses the ability to generate its own weather, and after that process what remains is a savanna, there must be an opposite process. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the Amazon rainforest. Now, if you know anything about like prehistory, one of the phases and one of the enabling factors in the Amazon rainforest becoming what it is today was a lot of wind carrying water from the Sahara Desert. So I guess I should back up, right? The creation of the Mediterranean Sea by the collision of Africa and Europe. Slowly these two continents come together, and there used to be a totally open sea in that area. And that sea then slowly closed over time, and what is still remaining is the Amazon rainforest. But part of what was the bottom of that sea is the Sahara Desert. And so when that was exposed, a whole bunch of wind took nutrients from the bottom of that desert and carried them across the Atlantic to the northern half of South America, and basically seeded the I guess I shouldn't say seeded because that's too easy to misinterpret, but it fertilized a whole swath of forest to grow, and that swath of forest is what is now the Amazon rainforest. That's sort of the order of events. The sea starts to dry up in, I guess, the Mediterranean region and the Sahara region, and that leads to a bunch of nutrients being liberated and flowing over, fertilizing a bunch of the trees, growing a huge forest. That huge forest then creates its own weather, creates a lot of rain. That makes a really good habitat for new seedlings. And those seedlings grow up and grow up and grow up, and you see how it's like a self-sustaining process. So let's go back to the water cycle, right? In the absence of trees, water evaporates still from the ocean, just because it's water and it's evaporating, and it's just like our survival little water purifying bell. Rain happens, right? Water pools, water flows down, right? So what are the trees actually changing about that situation, right? Because rain still happens in the water cycle. There's still rain, when there are no trees. Well, every tree is just adding another place where water is getting sucked out of the soil and pushed back into the atmosphere. And what they're using to drive that is solar radiation and their surface area. And they use that to generate more surface area for more solar radiation to cause more evaporation. And as more evaporation happens on the land, it's not happening on the ocean. So the clouds that form are already where the trees are. So they're just causing water to cycle more on the surfaces where they exist. Okay, so they are ecosystem engineers that lead to more rain happening in an area, right? More area. I'm asking, because I think this makes sense, but I'm asking you, I guess, the viewer, do you think that makes sense? Do you think that makes sense as an explanation for whether trees are a benefit, or basically what their impact on the ecosystem is? Let me know in the comments. Are grasses better at this? I don't think so. But if they are, and you're like a grass scientist or grass wizard, let me know, because I would love to have a grass wizard friend. The net effect, okay, is that fire is harder to start. There's a lot more water, it has a lot of thermal mass, which is to say it takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of heat to heat up water to any substantial amount, and as soon as it's heated enough, it just becomes steam and carries that heat up into the atmosphere. So water is really good at cooling, and it's also really good at putting out fire because it is not itself flammable. There's no amount of heat that you can apply to water where it will then burn because it's oxidized hydrogen. It's literally the result of fuel burning. It's one of the results of fuel burning. So, you know, cellulose becomes water and carbon dioxide. Water is one of the products. So, it doesn't go back in time if you heat it up enough. Physics, some physicist is going to come at me in the comments. So bring it on. Bring it on. Tell me that time travel can be achieved by your microwave. Just super overclocking your microwave to the nth degree. You'll just suddenly be able to time travel. Okay, so what the fuck am I talking about? Let's see. Self-sustaining tree cities. Tree cities have to be achieved by world peace. If there are people in conflict, if there are people who want to commit violence against one another, if you live in a tree city, you are tremendously vulnerable. If there are enough tree cities for enough time, you might be able to create a situation where there's so much rain happening all the time that burning down your house is pretty hard to do. But things have to be very peaceful for a very long time for that to actually happen. Because if there's any conflict where it would benefit you to take out your opponent's housing, you would end up back in a situation where it's easier to burn down your opponent's house, right? So here's a little thought experiment, right? You're a bunch of apes, you're becoming more intelligent, you're having intergroup violence pretty regularly, and your environment is also drying out just a little bit because of factors you can't control, right? And there are lightning strikes and they cause fires, but most of the time those fires are small and they burn down quickly, right? So they're not really a threat. But one of your guys, one of your chimp friends, realizes that the last fire has brought about like a little coal, a little spark. And he knows where to go to get up the mountain to a dry place. And he starts bundling a bunch of sticks there. And he bundles and bundles and bundles a bunch of little sticks and makes a bunch of fuel, right? And then you go and you take your little coal that you've kept in a bunch of wet leaves and clay for, you know, a few weeks and manage to keep going. And you use it to burn down your neighbors, right? Your opposing little troop, your opposing little chimp troop. You burn down their little treehouse, right? Now they have nowhere to go, and they have a deep instinctive reason not to try to recreate that, and to instead build with something like stone that isn't going to get burned down, right? And I think you start to see, like, maybe these patterns are connected. Maybe the discovery and implementation of fire by early hominins resulted in a move from the trees. Am I saying that ancient chimpanzees made tree cities? No, that doesn't... But, like, how would we know? Seriously. Like, how would we know? If they just got burned down, and now that ecosystem that they were originally created in is a savanna, so fire predominates. Fires over generations burn down whatever traces could have been left behind in the soil. Right? I mean, the problems with that hypothesis are the same problems with any hypothesis that says that there's no evidence for this, right? There's no evidence for a hypercarnivorous 87-foot long, giant, ancient mollusk from the Cambrian that was like 7 times the mass of a blue whale. There's no evidence for that. We don't have beaks. We might have beaks if that was the case, right? But what if it was something that just didn't have a chitinous beak, right? What if it was just something that had like a soft mouth, and it was this ancient, giant Cthulhu monster that didn't fossilize? I could say that that's perfectly plausible, and I wouldn't actually be wrong, is the thing. Did it happen? It's irresponsible to say that it did, right? It's irresponsible to tell people that, like, that probably happened. Because, really, I mean, if we don't know whether or not it happened, we have no way of commenting on whether or not it's likely to happen. That makes no sense. But I think that's interesting to think about. Maybe this is some kind of ancestral condition, and, you know, violence and the perpetuation of violence in human societies caused us to leave the trees and to enter a sort of savanna lifestyle. That's an interesting idea. I think it's fun to play with that idea. It also parallels really nicely with this story of, like, the Garden of Eden. It just feels like if that was the history of humanity, getting into a series of conflicts and burning down our forest dwellings, and now having to fend for ourselves on the savannah, and going out and killing all of the megafauna everywhere else in the planet because we'd lost our sense of home and safety. I feel like the Garden of Eden would be a very on-the-nose sort of story to describe that without actually properly explaining what was going on. Just something to think about. Don't. I'm not writing a paper, you know. I left university because I don't like writing papers. So I'm just throwing this at the cultural zeitgeist to see what happens. Let's see. I think this is starting to shape up pretty nicely, actually. I think we can add another layer. Right. So. Just, you don't have to remove any material if you don't make any material. Now the glass. This is the last thing, right? This glass. I've just been adding glass, right? And you can see that the only thing that it could be connected to are these branches at the top and the bottom, right? If you tried to make something that was an extension of the stem, like of the trunk of the tree, it would have to create internal barriers to achieve that. So how does that happen, right? But if it's something that's coming off of the leaves, that kind of makes sense, right? If it is giant leaves that are transparent, that kind of makes sense. And so I've got a video that's coming out soon. It's an extension of the Fruit Punk Electronics, but I'm currently working on resin a lot. And I've realized that resin is a good way to... I can make glass. I can make something that looks transparent, and I can include colors, and if I pour it and then form it like the next day before it fully like sinters together and cures 100%, I can make really nice curvature that matches like a polymer clay skeleton. And the nice thing about resin, like art resin and epoxy resin, is it's actually kind of analogous to some of the material that's present in the outer layer of bark on a tree. So remember when I said that it's a series of straws inside the tree, and there's living tissue that's adding material to the inside, and that is then dying and being incorporated into the stem? Well, that line of living cells is also adding material to the outside of the bark. But the thing is that the bark then sheds chunks over time. So it's constantly shedding material from the outside. And that material is lignin. A lot of it is lignin. It's kind of held together with lignin. And lignin is basically like a biological resin. It's different chemistry. It's not epoxy chemistry. It is a type of free radical chemistry that causes the bonds to form. But what's happening is sort of similar. It's a liquid compound which is undergoing a chemical reaction to becoming a solid. And if you look at the way that resin flows down trees, you can see that it actually does make transparent material. It's just that the color is more like this than like green. So amber is that. So trees naturally do produce a liquid substance that can then become a solid. So does it make sense to have windows made out of resin? The problem with tree resin is it is unbelievably flammable. So tree resin is like, if you want to make a fire in 40 below, tree resin is what you want. You want something, because what happens is it lights on fire, it melts, it turns into a liquid, it becomes more flammable, and it keeps itself lit through that process of melting, because it's always releasing more gas and more liquid, and like self-accelerating the reaction. But it's also very persistent, so it's kind of like napalm. It holds on to things and seeps into things and keeps burning and burning and burning. So is it a good material for windows? If there's a lot of rain and no conflict or violence, then yeah. Then yeah, it's fine. But you know, if you're trying to make a structure that can defend itself and weather attempts at arson, it's probably not the right material. So glass might actually be a good material to use. It's inert, it's non-reactive, it's kind of biocompatible, it's very rigid. So basically, if it's under any stress, right, it'll start to deform. But I think that there's probably some kind of silico chemistry, so a hybrid with silicone plastic, right? So the resin, something where like you have a structure that you make, like you make a traditional plastic, you make the window, and then you connect it to the bark, so it's just resting against it. But the chemistry of the bark naturally forms chemical bonds to that transparent material, and it has enough flexibility that it warps into place and sort of sinters over time and literally gets connected to the bark. If that's the case, right, the limitation would be that it has to be surrounded by a loop. So like in this example, if you have some kind of biocompatible glass, or even something that is somehow being made by the tree, it needs to fill in a gap and be surrounded by wood. Now there's another problem, which I've been hinting at but never fully described, which is when you have a tree is a sphere of material with an outer shell. When you make a loop like this, right, if you scissor slice and make a loop, if you loop the tree to itself, it's no longer a sphere, it's a torus. So you've changed on a fundamental level what it is topographically. Now this structure has a torus in it, and as it grows, how does that last centerpiece get filled in? you actually do need something to resist the forces of that coming together. Because if it fully comes together and closes, what you've then got is a tube of bark, which, as I said earlier, is sacrificial material that living cambium is constantly shedding. That bark is essentially a little causeway for microbes and mushrooms to grow through. Since it's sacrificial material, it's not defended. Eventually something digs through and puts another hole in there again, right? So if you have solid something filling that in, that's better. Because then you've got bark up against the edges, and the only place for it to grow is outward around this, right? So eventually it'll grow out, and you'll have the same problem again. You could build out and maybe cut in and remove wood here and hope that it grows back enough that there's bark there, right? But you can see there's like an ongoing process that would have to be done in order to keep this sort of growing over time, right? It requires maintenance, requires additional effort. So it's not just like a one and done and it's completely finished, right? Because all of these stems in here are still getting thicker over time. There's still more branch material coming out, right? There's still more stuff happening. There's always more growth, and that growth is probably concentrated in the growth habit of the tree. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes trees grow more at the base and less, so like a pine tree, they grow out at the base and less out as you go higher up the tree. Some things grow where like the middle is what expands out the most, so you end up with a shape that's more like a sphere. Some things just grow up and don't bother with their lateral branches very much at all. There's just different structures for different types of trees. So la-di-da-di-da, 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 lightning. Lightning would be bad for these. So lightning rods, we have lightning rods. Could you have electricity in something like this? Yeah, you could have electricity in something like this, right? You could have solar energy, right? Which you'd have to block out some solar radiation with a solar panel, right? In order to cause. What would be better? What would be better? Let's see. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so what's the process? Buy land, splice a bunch of trees together, get a bunch of pieces of formed glass to sort of fill in the gaps between all of these different arch structures. And then from there, try and like defend it for 1,000 years. Alright. I mean, I think basically this idea is something that could work if it weren't for human nature. That's kind of like a moneyless society, right? If we all do the work that's necessary to sustain life and we all put in the effort, then it's actually not very much effort between all of us, especially with all of the technology that we have to enable, right? Things to be done faster. We could all support each other with like a few hours of work a day, right? If we weren't all being exploited by the wealthiest people on the planet to harvest us for money and effort and value, right? So if it weren't for the existence of those people, then society could move on from this money thing that got made up and told to us was important. Right? If people were peaceful, if people were completely kind and generous and giving and never had a reason to want to burn down each other's houses, we could have tree cities. Right? And I guess that's why, I mean, people always ask me when I tell them about this, they're like, why aren't you doing this? Like, why isn't this, like, your mission, right? Like, you're supposed to be doing this. And it's like, it doesn't really change much if I'm the only one in the world doing it. It doesn't do anything. It leaves no mark. It leaves no legacy. It has no real substantial value, I think. Like, it is something that I think if everyone or a lot of people knew about this idea, right, knew about trying to do this, and we started with a few structures, right, here and there in parks, right, as like artificial gazebos, right, and like just a few things here or there, and 100 years from now those structures are like well established and growing well and really green, and we're using a lot more like solar panels and wind, and everything's battery storage, and we're using like really advanced railgun technology to launch like rockets into space, so all of our space travel is carbon neutral, which is fucking important. Like, I think space travel is the future of our species, but I also think that space travel is unnecessary unless we have something of value to share. And at this point in human development, I don't think we have anything of value to share with the cosmos, or with alien life. I think the only way that we have that is if we have like a sustainable atmosphere, and you know, a more just society would be nice, would be really nice, right? Because, well, I mean, if we can't solve it with ourselves, we'll never solve it with aliens. You know, I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster, regardless, right? It's this problem of projecting ill intent onto others, and the more different those others are from you, the easier it is to do that. So I think it's possible to have like peaceful interaction with alien life. I think it's possible to do that, but I also think that it's like very, very tricky, especially the more fear-mongering, the more people think that alien life is going to be dangerous, I think the more likely to accidentally trigger a war or a conflict between us and an alien species. Like, the less trust there is to begin with, the harder it is to build trust at all. So this like dark forest hypothesis, it kind of pisses me off, because it kind of, it rubs me the wrong way, because it feels like preemptive propaganda against a perceived other, which inevitably causes conflict. When, you know, if we entered with positive expectations and a good outlook, there is a possibility of forming, you know, a good connection, an amicable, you know, mutually beneficial connection with an alien species, you know, like the dimethyl sulfide that just found on that potential new Haitian world, right? Like that, there, we might have just detected very recently alien life, and not even like on cosmic terms, not even that far away, you know? I mean, it's kind of like the equivalent of looking into a pair of binoculars at a distant hill and like, oh, there's a fire on that hill, right? It's like, we're probably not alone. And I think, I mean, I've suspected that for a very long time, but, you know, it's one thing to say like, oh, I always knew, but it's very different when there's actually evidence, and it feels like the cosmos has kind of just opened up, right? And, you know, I mean, there's always the chance, right, that maybe whatever alien species we run into is like the British on steroids, and they're hyper-colonialists, super advanced, and have absolutely no morals or like values or concept of rights or right and wrong, all like the British, And that if that's the case, any amount of good intentions won't result in a good outcome, right? We'll just get slaughtered. But, if they are peaceful and amicable, and we're peaceful and amicable, then we both win, right? It's the prisoner's dilemma. It's like, if only one of you is the bad guy, then it's a bad outcome overall. If both of you are the bad guy, it's a very bad outcome overall. But if one of you is the good guy, then it's a good outcome. So it's like a 25% chance if it was completely random, that exchange turns out well. And those aren't great odds. Those are bad. Those are bad odds, is what I would call those. Yeah. So, I don't know. Are Tree Cities possible? It entirely depends on humanity's capacity for good and how many fossil fuel executives manage to survive the 21st century. I think that's a very critical number to pay attention to, because anybody who's trying to accelerate the use of fossil fuels at this day and age is a threat to the human race itself. They are a threat to humanity's survival. Anybody telling you that natural gas, which is methane, is like a green alternative, the only thing green about it is it produces less carcinogens when burned. Maybe zero carcinogens. I mean, I don't know. But definitely it does produce less, like benzene, for example, than burning coal or wood, right? And those things also release heavy metals when they're getting burned, so you get like lead. Basically, fossil fuel propaganda is like shooting yourself in the foot and then shooting everyone in your life in the head. And I don't understand how, even from an individualistic perspective, you could justify it. And I think anybody who is still shilling for fossil fuels is trying to get us all killed, and they should be treated accordingly. That's all. That's all. So, can we do this? Can we actually have Tree Cities? Not without dismantling the fossil fuel industry, which is perpetuating climate change, making all of the risks associated with fire more dangerous, right? So, like the air quality risks, the direct damage to property, the risk to human life, all of those things are worse. The more fossil fuel, including natural gas, the more fracking is being done. All of those things. Right, and I mean, it's easy to sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, because the worst people in the world do collaborate, and they do have brains. They are intelligent, and they have ownership of the information networks, right? YouTube, they own YouTube, So, people who want political advantage, people who want control of others, right? It's just a pathetic outlook and approach to life, which makes it impossible to have good things, right? To have peace, to have something better. So, I don't know, what do? I'm a little artist, I make things, I tell stories, I pepper little bits of Tree Cities in there, and I make my propaganda for the bioluminescent plant cities, which will one day envelop the earth. Yeah, and I guess I vilify fossil fuel executives and media and bankers and the economic basis of our entire society. And will that change anything? No, probably not. But, I think there is something about an image. I think there's something about creating a form like this and talking about it, sharing it, explaining to others, I mean, I think because it connects to so many ideas that are so radical, and I don't know, I mean, I sound like the Unabomber sometimes, but like, it all connects. It all really connects, and I think there are a lot of reasons why it's tricky to change the way that things are structured, And like when you start to see it, you realize how all of these things that seem like, oh, they're just this way, are really enforced and rigidly enforced and prevented from being questioned, right? And so I don't know. I mean, could I get through to some of the people who like really want the world to be the way that it is, and be like, hey, you know what? I mean, like nobody benefits when it's impossible to grow crops anywhere on the planet because it's too hot and too dry, and there's so much rain that it's acting as a blanket, which is trapping more heat, and it just gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter every year. And you're, you know, Bill Gates, you're Jeff Bezos, you're Elon Musk, you're in a little bunker huddling somewhere, right? You've got your hydroponics, you're growing your algae, you've got some solar panels on the roof, like you're making a living somehow, right? But like, it's all done. The planet's cooked. It's just getting hotter. And you have some shielding, but there's no amount of shielding that'll ever stop you from burning alive in your bunker like a pressure cooker. And I'm not even saying that to be mean. That's just the inevitable consequence of living that kind of life. Of trying to take everything. If you try to take everything, if you try to take power, if you try to take over the world, you'll just destroy it in the process. And I don't see why, even for you, even for someone who is completely selfish and completely unconcerned with the labor that everyone does for you to be so wealthy and powerful, how can you justify that? How can you justify not doing things differently? But me, for now, I'm going to make a tree city every Saturday. One building at a time. I'm going to leave a little atrium at the top here so that there is somewhere to look down and kind of see some of the interiority of the structure. Just to have like a little glimpse, And this too. And how do we cap this off? I think with this one, I'm gonna make a little glass dome. I know I said it was a bad way to capture water, but it does kind of just feel like a nice way to have a solarium sort of built into all this. I think it just looks cute. So that's important too. Let's try like that. Elon Musk. Like, what kind of name? I don't know. What was... Oh. Was it Randall Musk? What's Elon's dad's name? Let's see. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, an unfortunate side effect of succeeding at this goal would be, like, and by goal I do mean, like, solving climate change. Like, actually having a better system that doesn't accelerate the process. Would be that, you know, billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and, you know, Bill Gates would all be able to survive and reproduce, and presumably their children would continue to exist on Earth, you know? Yeah. So, unfortunate side effect, but, like, you know, actually doing this might lead to their survival. So, just saying, I mean, it's like, do you want to survive? Because it's not going to happen if we don't solve climate change. It just won't. So, yeah, just some thoughts. A lot of confused rambling, but I think I'm going to call it there for today. But I think that has a bit of personality to it. No, wait. One more thing. Just nitpicks, but I think quality is in the details. They say devil's in the details. But God is in the details. And those vines will probably grow down there eventually, and I'd like to fill that in, but I just want a platform. And maybe that platform can also have some vines. Vines that spawn in the sky. And why do they spawn in the sky? How did you do that, Senpai sister? No. It had nothing to do with me. It just grew that way. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Like and subscribe. Share this video if you enjoyed it, found it interesting. Follow me on Patreon if you feel like it's worth it. And remember, no matter who you are, no matter what you're going through, it is always Tuesday. And have a nice day.